So I lost my last intro, so I'm doing it again. Welcome to the Authoress in Distress. I'm Sana, I'm the authoress, and I'm in distress. Today we're going to be talking about Show Don't Tell. So in Show Don't Tell, the goal is to get the reader to feel the scene as opposed to just knowing what's happening. So when you're in a really good scene, when you're reading a good book, when you're watching a good movie that's doing a great job of putting you in the story, you feel like you're that character. Everything is vivid. You can smell the smells, see the sights. It's wonderful. We've all had that feeling, and we all want to make a reader feel that feeling. So if you're here and you're here to learn about Show Don't Tell, then we're going to dive into it. Just a fair warning though, a couple of these tips are a little bit generic, but I tried to put my own spin on them so that they could have my own little zest. So let's get into it. First tip, number 1, remember that your reader isn't stupid. Assume that they aren't. A lot of writers that I find that use a lot of tell and don't show a lot, it seems like they're talking down to me as a reader, and that makes readers frustrated because you could have made that way more vivid and I would have lived in it rather than you just having to explain things to me. It's kind of like when you're watching a movie and there's a big twist and everything falls into place, and then you get to the end and the director feels the need to recap it for you, have a detective tell you what happened. I just watched the whole thing, I don't need you to explain it to me, and that kind of condescension can come across really badly in writing. So you want to make sure that you're using show don't tell so that your reader can draw their own conclusions. So a small way that you can do this is, instead of being like, Lucy was anxious, Lucy being my main character, I'm just going to use main characters' names. Lucy was anxious. Instead of telling the reader that Lucy was anxious, describe the way her hands were clammy, describe the way her eyes dart around, and describe the way that she just kind of feels like she wants to crunch in on herself. Describe those things rather than she was anxious, because in force-feeding your reader, she was anxious, what does that mean? It doesn't give your reader closer to your character. It doesn't make it so that they can draw their own conclusions about this character and the way she reacts to her anxiety. It doesn't come across the way you want it to, and it makes the reader feel like you think they're dumb. So remember that your readers are smart and treat them like that. Number two is that you should describe things using all of the 5 senses. So a lot of the times when I see or I'm reading a story and there's a lot of tell and don't show, when there's a lot of tell and not enough showing, I find that the writer usually relies on sight a lot. So instead of being like, Lucy saw the Jabberwocky, right? Let's use Alice in Wonderland. Lucy saw the Jabberwocky. Instead of being like that, explain with other senses. She could hear his thundering steps coming. He was so close, she could practically smell his breath. Things like that will create a more vivid picture and also make it so that you can't rely on telling as much, because it's really hard to tell when you're trying to when you describe things more sensorily, when you describe things using sensory details as opposed to just relying heavily on one sense or just telling what's going to happen. Okay, so number three is to show emotions and tell feelings. So one thing that I see a lot of new writers doing, or even little things that slip through, is that they will try to tell me emotions and then they'll try to describe feelings that don't really need to be described. Sometimes tell is important. This video is not saying that you should never tell the reader anything. Make them draw their conclusions about everything. No, you should definitely tell your reader that. So the difference between telling emotions and feelings, so I think of it more as the emotional and the physical realms, right? So if we're talking about, say, let's keep the Jabberwocky example, right? So let's say we're talking about how Lucy feels in that moment, right? Her emotions in that moment, right? So we're going to show those rather than telling them. So rather than be like, Lucy was scared to fight the Jabberwocky, instead of saying that, you want to be like, Sweat beaded on her forehead. She glanced at her allies. She tasted blood. Something like that, where it's like, or she tasted vomit in her mouth, where like she's so terrified she's gonna throw up. Like that, those are the kinds of sensory details that we can utilize from the last one to show those emotions, right? Whereas if we are going to go into feelings, like physical sensations, especially in fight scenes and things like that, you want to tell those as opposed to showing them. So if we're talking about the Jabberwocky, say she's holding the sword, right? She's holding the sword, she's ready to fight the Jabberwocky. So rather than being like, her hands were clammy around, like you want to just be like, she gripped her sword tighter. She swung. You don't want to be like, the sword whistled as it guided its way through the humid air. Like, making it too flowery, especially in a scene with a lot of action, can bog the scene down. So you want to, when it's a lot of physical sensation that you're describing, you want to make it very clear what's happening, because otherwise people will also get confused. I've had this problem before where I will not describe what my character is doing enough because I'm too much in her head. So there needs to be a balance between show, don't tell, but you need to make sure you're showing emotions, and telling, it needs to be more consolidated into physical sensations. Okay, so number 4, I think this is number 4. So number 4 is pertaining to settings. So with a lot of new writers or even experienced writers, especially fantasy, I find this all the time in fantasy and it pisses me off. So I know that a lot of people, especially fantasy readers, want to know a lot about the world, right? World building is one of my favorite things to do. I love describing a setting. I could go on for ages about a single room, but you don't want to do this, okay? Because more often than not, I find that even though I love learning about a place and a setting, if the author tries to force feed me those details about a place, like all at once, I get so bored. I find myself just skipping it. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, I won't need this information. It doesn't matter. I'm going to catch on to those few details that I need, like there's a sword in the corner, and move on from there, right? Okay, so in order to fix this, using show, don't tell, right? Because that's all telling the reader what this character's seeing, telling the reader what this place looks like, right? The room was square, there was a rug and a chair in the corner, and the window was south facing, and there was a bookshelf on the north wall, and that's so boring. Instead, have your character interact with the room, and even if she's not interacting with the room, if she's not, then the room doesn't need to be described in that much detail. You should only be describing just enough that the reader, because they're not stupid, see point 1, is able to create their own idea of the space. I know, it's so frustrating when you have an idea in your mind and you're like, this is what this room looks like, and I perfectly catered it to this thing, and I've written out a beautiful setting chart, and then your reader's like, so this room that you pictured was square. This reader is like, it's a circular room with a north-facing window and 8 bookshelves along every wall, and you're like, that's not what it looks like. But if it doesn't matter to how the story progresses, let them create their own picture, because they're going to do that anyway, so you might as well not bore them with the telling them. So have it be where your character interacts with the setting is where you add those details, okay? So instead of being like, it was a northern bookshelf on the northern wall facing the southern facing window, instead be like, as she turned with a book in hand from the bookshelf, she glanced out the window on the other wall to see a dragon. I don't know, like it should be, added in there like a little at a time. So if there's a blue rug, then have it be she scuffed the toe of her boot on the blue rug. Like, it's that easy. You just have to sprinkle it in, because by overloading your reader on setting description, it makes them feel dumb, and it also bogs down your story, because that's, as much as you feel like that is pivotal to your storytelling, you're here to tell a story. That's what writers do. They're here to tell a story. So don't let details and like a control thing, like I have to control what they see. Don't let those things keep you from telling your story, okay? Because that's what show don't tell is. You want to make people feel like they're in it. So by telling them the setting, you're not making them feel like they're in it. You're just making them feel like you're just making the story feel slower, you know? I don't know. It could just be a personal preference. I know that, you know, Tolkien's gotten far, and he does this a lot. But yeah, I don't know. It's just something I've noticed a lot, that really slows the story down. So if you're looking for like maybe show don't tell in setting is your biggest weakness, maybe try to utilize this technique. So number 5. Number 5 kind of goes along with number 4, because number 5 is be very specific about the details that you add in, okay? Assume that your reader is going to have a picture in their mind when they get there based on what you've told them, right? Based on what you've shown them, preferably, right? So if you're like, it was a medieval town, then they're probably going to picture a medieval town, right? But if it's a magical medieval town, make sure that the details you're sprinkling in throughout those scenes are details that create the difference between a medieval town and your medieval town. So you want to make sure you're very specific about the details that you add in, because your readers, because they're smart, will pick up on those things. So instead of telling your reader exactly what your character is wearing, then be like, she tripped and the heel of her shoe, of her red shoe stuck in the cobblestones, forcing her to, I don't know, you know, like that sort of thing. You want to add these little details throughout as opposed to just overloading your readers first thing. Okay, number 6. So this one is one of my favorites to utilize, because I find in a lot of books, people use dialogue, they don't use it for action enough, even though you could. So they expand on it too much. So here's my example. If a character is like talking to Lucy and they're like, hey, have a seat. You don't have to explain Lucy sitting down and the chair and all of these things. That's unnecessary. All you have to do is, Lucy, have a seat. Good. Now, let's talk about this topic. You know, like it all leads in, and you don't have to force feed your reader and tell them that Lucy sat, because they understand. Like if the conversation moves forward and there's no conflict about like Lucy not sitting or Lucy being stubborn and not sitting, then you assume that she sat, right? It's all, you want to make the dialogue work for the story as opposed to taking away from the story. So use dialogue by all means for action things, and don't expand on it. It's one of my favorite things, because it helps the story flow really well, because you're not breaking it up, you know? If they're about to have a conversation and it's like, Lucy, sit, I need to tell you something. You don't need to be like, Lucy fell into the chair dramatically and it squeaked as she sat. You don't need to do all that. You just need to be like, Lucy, sit. Okay, so I have news for you. Like, that's it. Dialogue. You don't need to expand on it. It's one of my favorite things to utilize, and I highly recommend you try it, because it's actually a lot of fun to see what you can get away with. So that has been my video on show don't tell. Those were my 7 tips. I think there were 7. I'm going to say 7. Those are my 7 tips on how to show don't tell, or at least how I utilize show don't tell. Of course, there are 1,000 other tips out there, so please don't just listen to me. Go do your own research. But these are some of my favorites to implement, and I feel like they make a story just that little bit more whimsical and wonderful, especially for fantasy. These are really useful because we're really heavy into settings, and fantasy writers, I find, are the ones who they really feel like they need to explain everything. So in utilizing show don't tell and being really aware of it as you're writing, then it could make your writing a lot better. So this video was requested by my friend Dakota. I love her. She's amazing. She's one of my writer buddies. We've been writing together for years. I sent her my little story snippets. If you've seen some of my other videos, I have talked about her before. She's one of my favorite people. Yeah, so I'm so glad that she recommended this. I hope you loved it. If you have any recommendations, leave them down in the comments. Also, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, debates, fears, anxieties, bad stuff, issues, complaints, or irritations, leave them down there as well. Press all the buttons, the bell, the subscribe, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.